We thought it'd be a good idea tonight to, rather than talk about design, talk about how design is communicated. I'm a journalist, and Deyan's background is journalism, and Deyan's in curation now, and 10 years ago started at the Design Museum. So Deyan, tell us about the difference between how you talk about design at a museum compared to when you were putting words on bits of chopped up dead tree.
In some ways it's the same. I've always thought that design and architecture are much too interesting simply to talk to the converted, to talk to people that know the subject in language that develops layers of elaboration that really is meant to confuse and obfuscate. And to me it's about being clear and direct and telling stories. And that was the way I worked as a journalist. I was very lucky. In my very early days as the Sunday Times, there was a sub-editor. Sub-editors don't exist anymore, but in the old days, the people actually checked the facts and made sure you could spell it properly, and et cetera, et cetera. And this guy said to me, "Look, never use the word fenestration when window will do." And that's really stayed with me ever since. That sense of tell stories for a wider audience, and that's what we did in Blueprint. We tried to make design come alive by putting faces on the cover at first, trying to communicate that there were people behind these objects, and in a way, I think. Moving on to museums, again you want to communicate a story. To me design is about telling stories, about understanding what something means as well as what it looks like. It's of course a much less opinionated, or appears to be a much less opinionated form. A museum does have to have a certain amount of providing a neutral platform of a kind, in a way that journalism does not. Journalism now has become about very strong opinions, something I think that's actually accentuated by the way that media works now. When I was a journalist, there was no online comment, and it felt like putting a message in a bottle. Sometimes you got some feedback, a lot of the times you didn't. Every so often someone tried to sue you, very rarely. Sometimes you will point out that that person you said was dead was in fact not dead. Editors did sometimes miss things. But now, of course, you have a much more direct relationship with your audience as a blogger or as people that contribute to you. I think another thing that seems to have happened is that there is a generation of journalists of your age who have moved out of magazines and into museums. If you think about one of your playmates at Icon, Kieran Long, is now at the Victoria and Albert Museum. He's very recently recruited Johanna Agerman Ross, who was also an Icon person, was she not, who then started her own magazine, Disegno. And she also has now been sucked into the world of museums. And you wonder why that is. And maybe it's because the resources are fading in print journalism to actually give people the chance to explore subjects in a kind of measured way. There's the instant lightning speed response, which is all very well for reporting the next big thing, but it's not necessarily the best way to reflect on what some of these wonderful things might do, or these not so wonderful things. And maybe that's what long-form journalism could once do, and maybe now the way that museums operate is beginning to actually move into some of this territory, to reflect on what it means that when Instagram was sold for $1 billion, it had 11 employees. It's replaced Kodak, which at its height had 80,000 well-paid, well-trained jobs. Design is about asking questions sometimes.
But is there anything that the internet does that museums can learn from? Because museums are very slow, aren't they? Whereas we can tell stories immediately, we can make the news in the blink of an eye. How do museums need to become faster or more responsive, or have that immediate feedback loop that the internet has?
I think they need to go at several speeds at once. So there is a layer of the slowness of taking 2 to 3, even 4 years to explore, research, secure the loans that go into a major exhibition. And that is to create a unique experience, to actually have the physical things which reflect on key stories. Cannot be done in magazines. But you also need to have another layer which does go more quickly. So, the Design Museum, we have the Beazley Designs of the Year, which every year we bring together 100 or so projects from around the world with 50 spotters, which is very much like journalism, and it's putting it in the context of the museum. But of course, then you provide a record and you keep that, and you look back. So the first time we did Designs of the Year, the overall winner was Yves Behar's One Laptop Per Child project, which then seemed extraordinary and now seems extraordinarily past. And yet actually having that as a record is something which informs our collection very well. The second year, it went to the Obama Hope poster. Then there's also, of course, the way that you present material in a museum. Museums once were places in which the whole story was the objects, and the curators and the keepers, as they were called, were keepers. Their job was to protect the stuff from the public. The public at one stage were a nuisance. Now I think curating is much more about using their collections to communicate and say things, and that's a very different approach. So a museum is a hybrid of many forms of communication.
Actually, I went down into my basement this afternoon. I was trying to find the first issue of Icon magazine, because before Dezeen I read Icon magazine, and we very much, the idea behind Icon magazine was, let's make it like Blueprint used to be in the early days. I couldn't find any copies of Icon magazine, which I thought was weird, but I did find a copy of Blueprint magazine. Strangely, the one without a person on the cover.
We shifted ground by that time, yeah.
Do you remember these things, these like paper things that people used to read? And then I thought it would be fun to print out, to show people what Dezeen looked like 10 years ago when we just started. So I printed out the homepage back in the early days. It's like unbelievably rubbish.
And you still love Thomas Heatherwick.
But do you know that the first story on Dezeen was about you?
You're making this up.
No, seriously. I got fired from Icon magazine, and I thought, now I can do that internet thing I've been thinking about for a while. And I'd heard from someone that the Design Museum, that Deyan had just started the Design Museum and was going to discontinue the Designer of the Year show and do Designs of the Year. And I called you up, and I was very much an old school print reporter and did an interview on the phone, and then spent all day turning that into a 300-word story, which was the first story that went up on Dezeen ever. And nobody gave a flying F about it. Got no visits whatsoever. And I thought,
not even my mother.
This is not going to work. I cannot spend all day writing a story that no one's going to read.
No more Sudjic, you
know. So the next day, some French, I think it was Morphosis, sent me some pictures of a skyscraper they were proposing in Paris, I think it was, this banana-shaped skyscraper, and I thought, why don't I just put the pictures up and not write anything? And that's when Dezeen took off. And that was like, as a journalist, that was insight number one. People want pictures rather than words. And insight number two was this weird comments thing, because on Icon, we'd literally cobbled together, we cheated like crazy on our letters page.
You wrote them all.
No, we didn't. Sometimes people would send us round-robin emails, and we'd publish them as letters just for fun. And the idea that people could then contribute to our journalism and create debate and provide insights was like a really astonishing, profound leap, actually.
When there was no internet, magazines like that one, like others I've worked for, Domus, like your magazines, survived not by people buying them, but by people paying to advertise in them. And that has now more or less vanished. So the economic model that kept such beautiful magazines as Domus in business is under serious threat. So how does one actually keep those values and that quality? And it's
and an interesting point that you mentioned, that actually I think I'm the only senior person from the original Icon team who's still in journalism, because Justin McGuirk is now working with you. Chris Turner, who was then so of the three editors that came after me, all of them now work in curation, because Chris Turner is now director of the Biennale. Yeah. But is there an economic reason for that? Is that because people simply can't make a living in media anymore? Do museums pay better, is I guess another way of looking at that?
I can't say that museums pay great, because people like working in them. So you get very smart people to do that. When we did our first exhibition on Zaha Hadid, something like 60,000 people paid £12 for the ticket to go and see that. 60,000 people. No book on architecture has ever sold 60,000 copies. And it's a form which people will pay for, to go and see this unique physical experience.
Mm. And maybe just to wrap up now, we had a meeting with one of your team the other day about, by the way, Deyan very modestly hasn't mentioned the new design museum that's being built, so that's about to open.
Yes, on November the 24th, a 10,000 square metre, thank you very much for the prompt, a 10,000 square metre museum.
Isn't that why you're here, right?
which will be 10,000 square metres, with free admission to the top floor for the first time, with its collection, which will tell the story of design from the perspective of the user and the maker as well as the designer, with a fantastic restaurant, with a 200-seat auditorium, in an exquisite conversion of a 1962 landmark by John Pawson, for which we have raised so far £48 million, in part of which, thank you very much Molteni for being very generous in their support of the Design Museum auction at Phillips, will change the way that the world sees design museums. Thank you very much. Yes, what was I saying?
But also we had a meeting about, and I'm probably like breaking all kinds of embargoes, and I don't even know you know about this yet, but we had a meeting of discussing how at the end of the year we could come and do an evening in the museum where we talked about the things that have been most in the news over the year. So maybe there's a way that publications like ours that have no physical presence can work with institutions like yours that do, and come together and sort of help we do the same thing in a way. We talk about design, we share information about design, but maybe actually collaborate on doing that.
Sounds like a brilliant idea.
What day is that on again? Was it
Who's paying for it?
Watch this space. Thanks very much for being such a patient and engaged audience. And thank you very much, Julia, for inviting us to do this.